When I say, the American government, what pops into your head?
Oh, I mean, probably the president, right? Sitting behind the resolute desk.
Exactly. Or maybe you picture Congress arguing on the steps of the Capitol building, or the 9 justices of the Supreme Court in their black robes.
Right. The classic three branches.
Yeah, but what if I told you that right now there aren't just 3 branches of government? There are actually over 89,500 separate, distinct governments operating in the United States simultaneously.
I mean, it completely shatters the illusion that American politics is just this, singular top-down machine operated out of Washington, D.C.
It really does.
The reality is infinitely more fractured
hmm
and, frankly, a lot more chaotic.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We are jumping into an absolute behemoth of a source today. It's a massive encyclopedic analysis detailing the politics of the United States.
It is dense.
Very dense. And what I love about this stack of research in front of us is that it entirely strips away the partisan talking points, the stuff you hear on cable news.
Oh, absolutely. There's no spin here.
Right. It just gives us the cold, hard demographic data, the historical statutes, the math of how power works, and the political science studies measuring who actually gets what they want.
Which is exactly how we're going to approach it today.
Yeah.
I mean, we are looking at the blueprints of the system.
Yeah.
Our goal isn't to take a side.
Uh,
And we certainly aren't endorsing any specific political viewpoints.
Definitely not. We're strictly impartial guides here.
Right. We are just following the data to understand the original design of the American political machine, how it actually operates today, and, well, where the most critical stress fractures are showing.
Yeah, we are just the messengers for the math and the history. But let's go back to that number, because I honestly haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I read the source text.
The 89,500 local governments.
Yes. How is that even structurally possible?
Well, to understand that, we really have to understand the core operating system of the United States, which is federalism.
Okay, break that down for me.
So the U.S. functions as a constitutional federal republic.
Right.
You have the national or federal government on one level and the state governments on another.
Right.
But the power dynamic between the two is incredibly specific. And it's completely different from how most other countries operate.
In what way, exactly?
Well, in most nations, the central government has all the power, right?
Aye.
And it simply delegates tasks to local provinces. Like, here's your budget, go do this.
Okay.
But in the U.S., the federal government actually operates on limited granted powers. It can only do what the U.S. Constitution explicitly says it can do.
Like print money or declare a war.
Exactly. Or regulate interstate commerce.
Right.
If a power isn't explicitly listed in that document, the federal government theoretically cannot touch it.
So the states just get everything else by default.
Yes, exactly. The states operate on what legal scholars call inherent powers.
Yeah.
They are the default sovereigns. A state government can basically act and make laws on anything. Education, family law, contract law, speed limits, most criminal offenses, unless it is specifically prohibited by the national constitution or its own state constitution.
Meaning every single one of the 50 states is essentially operating as its own mini-republic.
Oh, down to the very last detail. Each of the 50 states has its own fully drafted constitution. Each has its own distinct 3 branches.
Just like the federal government.
Right. An executive branch, headed by a governor, a judicial branch with its own state Supreme Court, and a legislative body to write the laws.
And actually, the text points out a really fun piece of trivia here regarding those state legislatures.
Oh, the Nebraska thing.
Yeah. So 49 of the 50 states essentially copy-pasted the federal blueprint. They have a bicameral legislature, meaning a House of Representatives and a Senate.
Right.
But Nebraska decided to go totally rogue.
Yeah, Nebraska is completely unique. They operate a unicameral legislature. Just one single legislative house. No separate Senate to pass bills back and forth with.
It's just so fascinating that the system allows for that kind of massive structural deviation. But if we visualize this whole setup, it's not just 2 levels.
No, not at all.
It's more like a set of Russian nesting dolls. Or like an incredibly convoluted corporate org chart.
That's a great way to put it.
You have the massive federal government on the outside. You open that up, and inside you find 50 separate state governments. You open up a state, and inside you find counties. The text says there are 3,033 county governments in America.
And we are still just scratching the surface there.
Right, because you open up those counties, and inside you find over 19,000 municipalities, 16,500 townships, and tens of thousands of what are called special purpose districts.
Like school districts, water districts, fire protection districts.
Exactly. You add them all up and you hit that staggering 89,500 number.
And the reason this matters, the reason political scientists obsess over this nesting doll structure, is that those tiny inner dolls are the ones that actually dictate your daily life.
Yeah, the stuff you interact with every day.
Right. The federal government gets, 99% of the media coverage. But it's your local municipal government that handles the police department, the fire protection, the sanitary codes.
Health regulations, zoning laws, filling potholes.
Exactly. Public transportation. And the rules of the game completely change when you get down to that municipal level.
Well, in a way.
Well, the text notes that local politics often strips away the heavy partisanship we see in Washington. And that happens in two major ways.
Okay.
First, many local elections are entirely nonpartisan by law.
Really? Like, you don't run as a Democrat or Republican?
Exactly. You literally do not have a D or an R next to your name on the ballot. Candidates have to run on their actual local platforms, and they often suspend their party affiliations entirely while governing.
Which, I mean, that makes sense. There really isn't a conservative or a liberal way to fix a pothole, right? Or negotiate a garbage collection contract.
Precisely. And the second way it changes is structural. Many American cities don't even use a traditional elected mayor to run the daily operations.
Wait, then who runs the city?
They use what is called a council manager system.
Hmm.
So the citizens elect a city council, and then that council acts almost like a corporate board of directors.
Oh, interesting.
They go out and hire an unelected, highly paid professional administrator, a city manager, to actually run the city's departments.
So you have a professional bureaucrat running the day-to-day rather than, like, a charismatic politician making speeches.
Exactly. It's a completely different flavor of democracy.
But looking at the sheer scale of this, I mean, hundreds of thousands of elected offices across 89,000 governments, it brings up a massive logistical question.
How do they win?
Yeah. How do people actually win these seats? Because every time I look at a ballot, whether it's for president or the local water board, I basically only see two viable options.
Right, the classic two-party system.
Yeah, we are a nation of 330 million people. Why are we locked into just two political parties?
To understand that, we really have to look at the brutal underlying mathematics of the American voting system.
The map.
Yeah. Almost all public officials in America are elected from what we call single-member districts. And they win office by securing a plurality of the votes.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener. A single-member district just means that for any given geographic area, like a congressional district or a city ward, only one person gets the job.
Right. There's no proportional representation. There's no second-place trophy.
And plurality means what? First past the post.
Exactly. You do not need a majority. You don't need over 50% to win. You literally just need one more vote than the next person.
Okay, give me an example.
So if candidate A gets 34%, candidate B gets 33%, and candidate C gets 33%. Candidate A wins the seat entirely.
Wow.
The 66% of people who voted against them get absolutely zero representation.
And our sources point out that this specific mathematical formula is the entire reason the United States is one of the only developed democracies in the world completely dominated by a two-party duopoly.
Yeah, it's an ironclad rule in political science. It's known as Duverger's law.
Duverger's law.
Right. Maurice Duverger was a French sociologist who observed that plurality rule elections structured within single-member districts will almost inevitably result in a two-party system.
So it's not some, like, cultural accident.
Not at all. It is mathematical gravity.
Walk me through how that gravity actually works on the ground. Let's say we have a local election.
Okay, let's imagine a district where the voters are generally center-left.
Yeah.
You have a moderate progressive candidate who usually wins.
Okay.
But then a very far-left progressive candidate enters the race, representing a third party, maybe the Green Party.
Right.
Now, the center-left voter base is fractured.
They split the vote.
Exactly. Let's say the moderate progressive gets 30% and the far-left progressive gets 25%.
So combined, they represent 55% of the district. That's a clear progressive majority.
Yes, but because they split their votes, the single conservative candidate in the race secures 45% of the vote.
Oh, I see.
Under first-past-the-post rules, the conservative wins the seat with a mere 45%. Even though the majority of the district voted for progressive platforms.
So the system actively punishes you for voting for a third party.
It really does.
Like, if you genuinely prefer that far-left candidate, but you know they don't have the absolute highest chance of winning, Voting for them is mathematically dangerous. You end up handing the election to the candidate you disagree with the most.
Which is exactly why voters quickly learn to engage in strategic voting.
Right, holding your nose and voting.
Yeah, you stop voting for the candidate you actually love, and you start voting for the lesser of two evils, the major party candidate who is closest to your views, just to block the candidate you hate.
So third parties are starved of votes, not necessarily because their ideas are unpopular, but because the mathematical structure of the system makes voting for them a massive risk.
That is the core of Duverger's law.
That makes total sense mathematically. But what's wild to me is that the history of voting in America shows that the parties didn't just rely on math to maintain this duopoly.
Oh, definitely not.
They used the actual physical mechanics of the ballot itself to enforce total loyalty. I was reading the historical section of our sources, and my jaw dropped when I realized that in the 19th century, the secret ballot did not exist.
No, it was completely unheard of. Voting was an entirely public event.
That is so crazy to me.
It was. In fact, for a long time, the idea of voting in secret was considered unmanly or cowardly or underhanded. If you were a proud citizen, you were expected to stand up and declare your allegiance in front of your whole community.
The text describes how originally you would just walk up to the polling place, which, by the way, might be a local tavern or a courthouse square, and you would literally shout your vote out loud to the clerk.
A vivoce vote, yeah.
But even when they transitioned to paper ballots, it wasn't the government printing them, right? The political parties themselves printed their own ballots.
They were called party tickets. And the parties were incredibly strategic about it.
How so?
They didn't print identical white pieces of paper. They color-coded them.
Oh, wow.
The Democrats might print a bright pink ticket, and the Republicans might print a bright green ticket.
So you'd walk into this chaotic, crowded polling place, probably a tavern, and party operatives would shove a bright pink ticket into your hand.
That's exact.
And then you'd have to walk up to the ballot box holding this brightly colored piece of paper so everyone in the town square knew exactly who you were voting for.
Which completely eliminated the concept of ticket splitting.
Right, because you couldn't vote for a Republican for mayor and a Democrat for governor. You were just dropping a pre-printed single-party list into the box.
Yep, and the social pressure must have been absolutely unbearable.
Well, the source text points out that this system led to intense physical voter intimidation. You often had to physically push your way through mobs of partisans trying to stop you from casting the wrong color ticket.
It frequently escalated into actual violence.
Yeah. The text cites a specific statistic that in the mid-19th century, Election Day riots resulted in at least 89 deaths.
Just staggering.
People were literally being killed over casting a ballot.
It was an incredibly volatile environment. It wasn't until the late 19th century, following a series of massive corruption scandals, that states finally began adopting what was known as the Australian secret ballot.
Why Australian?
Because the system of government-printed uniform ballots cast in private booths was first pioneered in Australia in the 1850s. When it was imported to the U.S., it fundamentally changed the mechanics of democracy. Suddenly, you could vote your conscience without fear of losing your job or being physically assaulted in the street.
But even with the secret ballot, the two major parties didn't just give up their power, right?
Of course not.
The text notes that the state legislatures, which were already entirely controlled by Democrats and Republicans, simply shifted their tactics. Instead of mob violence, they used bureaucracy.
It's much cleaner that way.
Right. They passed incredibly strict ballot access laws, requiring independent or third-party candidates to gather massive numbers of petition signatures in impossibly short timeframes, just to get their names printed on the new government ballots.
Exactly. They replaced physical gatekeeping with legal gatekeeping, ensuring the two-party duopoly remained perfectly intact.
But wait, if we trace this all the way back, there is a massive historical contradiction here.
Oh, the founders.
Yes. We know the Founding Fathers explicitly warned against this. George Washington dedicated a massive chunk of his farewell address to warning the nation about the baneful effects of the spirit of party.
He was terrified of it.
And Alexander Hamilton and James Madison wrote extensively in the Federalist Papers about the dangers of factions. So if the architects of the system hated political parties so much, how did we end up with this deeply entrenched two-party system almost immediately?
It is arguably the great irony of American political history.
Yeah.
The founders designed a system meant to prevent factions, but the very act of trying to govern within that system immediately created them.
Almost overnight, right.
It started directly inside George Washington's own cabinet.
Between Hamilton and Jefferson.
Precisely. You had Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury. He believed in a strong central government, a national bank, and an economy based on commerce and manufacturing.
Right, the urban industrial vision.
And his followers became known as the Federalists. On the other side, you had Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. He envisioned a decentralized agrarian republic built on states' rights and small farmers.
And his faction became the Democratic Republicans.
Yes, so the two-party system was literally born during the very first administration, despite Washington begging them not to do it.
And from that initial fracture, the text traces a continuous evolutionary chain. The Federalists eventually collapsed after the War of 1812, right?
Yeah, and they were essentially replaced by the Whig Party. Meanwhile, Jefferson's Democratic Republicans evolved into the modern Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson in the 1820s.
And what happened to the Whigs? I don't see them on my ballot today.
The Whigs imploded in the 1850s over the issue of expanding slavery into the Western territories. They couldn't maintain a unified platform, so their northern anti-slavery faction broke away to form the Republican Party.
Which saw its first successful presidential candidate in Abraham Lincoln.
Exactly.
Okay, so since the Civil War, we have had the exact same two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. That is over 150 years of identical branding.
The branding is identical, yes.
But the text makes a really critical distinction here. The names stayed the same, but what the parties actually stand for and who votes for them has radically flipped over time.
This is a crucial concept. Unlike parliamentary systems in Europe, where a political party is a rigid top-down organization that dictates policy and can expel politicians who don't fall in line, American political parties are incredibly decentralized.
They're more like loose clubs.
Essentially, yes. They are just loose coalitions of various interest groups.
Yeah.
And those coalitions are constantly shifting.
How does a coalition shift like that? Let's look at a historical example from the text.
Well, the most dramatic example detailed in the source is the realignment that started with the New Deal.
Okay, the 1930s.
In the 1930s, Franklin D. Roosevelt forged a massive, dominant Democratic coalition. It included small farmers, northern city dwellers, organized labor unions, and the Solid South.
Wait, the Solid South?
Yeah, white Southerners who had voted strictly Democratic ever since the Civil War.
But that is a wildly contradictory group of people. You have progressive northern union workers in the same party as conservative southern segregationists.
Exactly. It was an alliance of convenience based heavily on economic relief during the Great Depression. But it was incredibly fragile.
Right.
Fast forward to the 1960s, and the Democratic Party, led by Lyndon B. Johnson, champions and passes the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
Which shatters the coalition.
It completely breaks the alliance. The Solid South feels betrayed by the National Democratic Party's stance on civil rights and begins looking for a new political home.
And the Republicans were waiting right there.
The Republican Party, under Richard Nixon, recognizes this demographic opening and initiates the Southern strategy, actively appealing to those disaffected white Southern voters.
And within a generation, the electoral map completely flips. The South becomes the bedrock of the Republican Party.
And we are seeing these coalitions continue to shift in real time today.
Really? How so?
Well, the text points out that the Republican base is increasingly capturing working class and rural voters across the entire country, while the Democratic base is increasingly dominated by college-educated and urban voters.
It's fascinating. The brand names Democrat and Republican survived, but the people sitting inside those vehicles completely swapped seats.
That's a great analogy.
So you have these two massive, decentralized, constantly shifting coalitions. And every 2 years, they go to war to control the federal government.
A very expensive war.
Exactly. Running campaigns to reach over 330 million Americans across 50 states requires an unbelievable amount of resources. You have to buy television ads, digital data operations, armies of consultants. Who is paying for all of this?
It's certainly not cheap.
And more importantly, what are they expecting in return for their money? This leads us straight into the influence market, or what the political scientists in our sources describe as a civil oligarchy.
The sheer volume of capital required to participate in American federal elections is staggering. The primary driver, as you mentioned, is advertising, specifically television and digital media buys.
Give me the numbers from the text.
The source notes that the average winning budget for a seat in the House of Representatives is $2.7 million.
Wow.
And to win a Senate seat, The average cost skyrockets to $26.5 million.
$26.5 million just to get a job that pays around $174,000 a year.
Yeah, the math doesn't quite add up for a regular person, does it? And that is just the campaign spending.
Right.
If you look at lobbying, the money spent trying to influence those politicians once they were actually in office, the numbers are even higher. Our source notes that in 2024, lobbying groups spent a record-breaking $4.4 billion trying to sway federal lawmakers.
$4.4 billion. Where is all this money coming from? Because it's not just coming from average citizens chipping in $20 a month.
No, a massive portion of it comes from special interest groups and political action committees,
Yeah.
commonly known as PAC geeks.
We hear the term PAC constantly on the news. How do they actually operate?
So a PAC is essentially a legally recognized organization that pools campaign contributions from its members and then donates those funds to campaign for or against candidates.
Okay.
They're usually organized around specific interests, like corporate business sectors, powerful labor unions, or ideological causes. Now, there are strict legal limits on how much money a PAC can give directly to a candidate's campaign.
But there's a loophole, right?
A massive one. While they can't hand a candidate unlimited cash directly, there are virtually no limits on what these groups can spend independently.
Independent expenditures.
Exactly. A PAC can spend $10 million producing and airing brutal attack ads against a candidate's opponent, as long as they don't explicitly coordinate their strategy with the candidate's official campaign.
So millions and millions of dollars are flowing from these wealthy elite groups and corporations into the political ecosystem. What is the return on investment? What do they actually get for all that cash?
Well, our source cites a genuinely chilling study from 2014 to answer that.
Yes, the Gilens and Page study.
Right, by two prominent political scientists, Martin Gilens from Princeton and Benjamin Page from Northwestern. I think we need to dig into this because their findings basically challenge the entire premise of American democracy.
How did they measure this?
It was an incredibly rigorous, data-driven study. Gilens and Page looked at nearly 1,800 different policy issues between 1981 and 2002.
That's a huge sample size.
It is. They gathered polling data to see what the average American citizen wanted on those 1,800 issues. Then they looked at what economic elites and organized business interest groups wanted on those exact same issues.
Okay.
Finally, they looked at the actual laws Congress passed.
They tracked who won the tug of war.
Exactly. And what they found was a profound systemic disconnect between public opinion and government action. When the preferences of the average citizen aligned with the preferences of the economic elites, the laws usually passed.
Okay, sure. Everyone agrees the law gets made. That's easy.
But the critical test is what happens when they diverge. What happens when the majority of average citizens strongly want a policy, but the wealthy elites strongly oppose it?
Who wins?
The elites win, almost every single time.
Wow.
Gilens and Page concluded that the U.S. government does not primarily represent the interest of the majority of its citizens. The system operates with a massive status quo bias.
What does that mean?
It means it is structurally much easier to kill a bill in Congress than it is to pass one. So if wealthy interest groups want to block a change that the public actually wants, they have immense power to do so.
They actually used the term civil oligarchy, didn't they?
They did. They stated that the preferences of the average American appear to have, and this is a direct quote from the study, minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy.
A near zero impact. I mean, that is deeply depressing.
It really is.
But let me push back on this because it feels like there is a massive logical contradiction here. If the average voter truly has a near zero impact on what laws get passed, why do politicians spend those tens of millions of dollars on campaign ads begging for our votes every 2 years?
That's a fair question.
If we don't matter, why are they knocking on our doors?
It seems like a paradox, but it perfectly explains how the system operates if you separate the election phase from the governing phase.
Okay, explain that.
The voters are the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
You absolutely have the power to select which candidate gets the job. Politicians must win elections to get the power, so they spend millions to persuade you to pull their lever.
Okay, so they need us to get through the door.
But once they are inside the door, the actual policies they write, the amendments they draft, and the votes they cast on complex regulatory bills, those are heavily shaped by the elites and the organized interest groups that funded their campaigns in the first place.
Because they're already thinking about the next election.
Exactly. The source notes that politicians are constantly looking ahead. They know they will need millions of dollars again in 2 or 6 years. Therefore, They spend a disproportionate amount of effort satisfying those wealthy lobbyists rather than serving the ordinary citizens who just watched a TV ad and voted for them.
So to use an analogy, the voters get to pick who sits in the driver's seat of the car, but the lobbyists and the wealthy donors already programmed the GPS destination before the car even started.
That is exactly the dynamic the data suggests.
Which leads to a very painful realization. If policy is being driven behind closed doors by elite interest groups, who exactly is being represented in the halls of power, and more importantly, who is being left out entirely? Let's unpack the concept of the representation gap.
Because representation in a democracy isn't just a mathematical calculation of votes, right? It's deeply tied to who is physically sitting in the room making the decisions.
Right.
The text spends a lot of time analyzing what political scientists call descriptive representation.
Break that down for us. What does descriptive representation mean?
It refers to a dynamic where political representatives share the demographic backgrounds, characteristics, or lived experiences of their constituents, whether that's race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or class.
Okay.
Having that shared background provides two major benefits: symbolic and functional.
Symbolic meaning what? It just looks like the country.
It's deeper than just appearances. Symbolically, it gives marginalized citizens a sense of emotional identification and trust in the system.
I see.
If you see someone who looks like you or comes from your background wielding power, you are much more likely to believe the system is legitimate and that your voice matters. But the functional benefit is where the actual policy gets made.
Meaning descriptive representation actually changes the laws that get written.
Yes, the data shows that lived experience directly dictates legislative priorities. For example, the text notes that when African American or Latino representatives hold positions of institutional power, specifically when they serve as congressional committee chairs, issues affecting those minority communities are significantly more likely to be addressed.
Because in Congress, committee chairs are the ultimate gatekeepers. They are the ones who decide which bills get a public hearing and which bills die silently in a desk drawer.
Exactly. If the person holding the gavel understands the nuance of an issue because of their lived experience, that issue gets oxygen. It gets debated.
But despite some progress, the demographic makeup of the government still vastly misaligns with the makeup of the country.
Very much so. Let's look at gender, for instance.
Okay, give me the numbers on that.
Well, women have actively voted at higher rates than men in every single presidential election for over 40 years.
Every single one.
For over 4 decades, yes. Yet in the 117th Congress, there were only 122 women in the House of Representatives compared to 319 men.
Why is that gap so stubbornly persistent? If women outvote men, why aren't they represented equally in the chamber?
The sources point to a complex mix of structural and social headwinds. Structurally, unlike some other democracies, the U.S. does not have statutory gender quotas for party candidate lists.
Right.
Socially, women face a political environment that is often perceived as hostile, and there are unequal fundraising dynamics. The data shows that male donors, who control more capital, tend to donate more heavily to male candidates.
And the text also mentions geographic structural issues, right?
Yes, that's a big one. While political map makers can sometimes use gerrymandering to concentrate racial minority groups into specific districts to ensure they win at least some representation, you can't really do that with women.
Because they're everywhere.
Exactly.
Right.
Women are distributed evenly across the entire country, so they don't benefit from that kind of structural geographic concentration.
So we have these significant representation gaps for women, racial minorities, and the LGBTQ+ community. But as I was reading the source text, I hit a section that completely blew my mind.
Oh, the territories.
Yes, we spend so much time debating groups that are underrepresented. But there's an entire group of Americans who have literally no voting representation at all. I am talking about the millions of people living in U.S. territories.
This is one of the most critical and, frankly, most ignored blind spots in American politics.
It really is.
The United States currently possesses 16 island territories, including permanently inhabited places like Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Northern Mariana Islands.
And to be incredibly clear to you listening, the people born in these territories, with the exception of American Samoa, who are U.S. nationals, are full United States citizens.
Yes, they are.
They carry American passports, they pay certain federal taxes, like payroll taxes, they are subject to all federal laws passed by Congress, and they have to register for the military draft.
Yet, despite being citizens who can be drafted to fight and die in American wars, they are completely legally barred from voting for the President of the United States. Furthermore, they do not have any voting representation in the Senate or the House.
They only get what's called a non-voting resident commissioner, right?
Yes, they can send a representative to Washington who can sit in committee meetings and debate. But when it comes time to actually cast a binding vote on the floor of the House to pass a law, they are not allowed to vote.
I mean, how is that legally justified? The entire founding myth of the United States is no taxation without representation. How can you draft a citizen into the military and deny them a vote?
The legal framework keeping this in place traces back to a highly controversial series of Supreme Court decisions from 1901. They're collectively known as the Insular Cases.
What was the historical context of that? Why 1901?
This was right after the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. acquired new overseas territories like Puerto Rico and Guam.
Okay.
The fundamental constitutional question was, does the Constitution follow the flag? Meaning, if the U.S. owns a territory, do the people living there automatically get the full protections and rights of the U.S. Constitution?
And the Supreme Court said no.
The court ruled that full constitutional rights do not automatically extend to all places under American control. They created a distinction between incorporated territories, which were destined for statehood, and unincorporated territories, which were not.
Unbelievable.
The text explicitly notes that today, legal scholars across the entire political spectrum fiercely criticize the Insular Cases. They argue these rulings were deeply rooted in the imperialism and outright racist assumptions of the early 20th century.
Right, assuming the inhabitants of these islands were somehow unfit for full self-government.
Exactly.
It creates this bizarre Twilight Zone scenario for citizenship. Let's say you are a U.S. citizen living in New York. You have full voting rights. You can vote for president. You have 2 senators. You have a House representative.
Yep.
But if you decide to pack up and move to Puerto Rico, the moment you change your zip code, you instantly lose your right to vote for president and your voting representation on Congress.
You are exactly the same citizen, but your geography strips you of your fundamental democratic rights, which is why many scholars in the text argue that residents of these territories are legally treated as second-class citizens.
It is absolutely staggering. But what's even more frustrating is that even for the citizens living in the 50 states who do have the right to vote, structural quirks in the constitutional blueprint mean their votes do not carry equal weight.
Right.
Which leads us to the overarching theme of this entire deep dive, the structural disconnect.
If you look at how modern political scientists analyze the American system today, the defining characteristic they point to is that it is incredibly counter-majoritarian.
Counter-majoritarian.
Yeah. Stephen Levitsky, a prominent political scientist cited in our text, describes the United States as, quote, far and away the most counter-majoritarian democracy in the world.
Let's make sure we clearly define that for the listener. It means a system where the majority of the population wants one thing or casts their votes one way, but the structural mechanics of the system deliver the exact opposite result. The majority loses.
Exactly. And we see this counter-majoritarian gravity warping all 3 branches of the federal government.
Let's start with the executive branch.
Okay, the Electoral College. Because the president is not elected by a simple national popular vote, but rather by a state-by-state allocation of electoral points, the math allows for a scenario where you can win the presidency while millions more human beings actually voted for your opponent.
Which historically used to be an incredibly rare anomaly.
It was. Before the year 2000, a popular vote loser winning the presidency had only happened 3 times in American history, all clustered in the 19th century.
Right.
But the text highlights that the math is shifting in the modern era. As of the text's publication in 2022, 2 of the past 4 presidents took the oath of office despite losing the national popular vote: George W. Bush in 2000 and Donald Trump in 2016.
So the structure of the executive branch is demonstrably counter-majoritarian. What about the legislative branch? The Senate seems to be the ultimate offender here because it creates this massive small state bonus.
Oh, the Senate is the anchor of this structural disconnect. The design of the Senate was the result of the Great Compromise of 1787.
At the Constitutional Convention.
Right. Small states basically threatened to walk out unless they were given equal power to the large states. So the deal was struck. Every state regardless of its population size, gets exactly 2 senators.
And in 1790, maybe that wasn't a world-ending disparity.
The text provides the exact numbers. In
Hmm.
1790, the largest state was Virginia. It had about 13 times the population of the smallest state, Delaware.
Okay, 13 to 1.
A 13-to-1 ratio is significant, but it didn't break the math of the country.
But look at the math today. California is our largest state. It has 68 times as many residents as Wyoming. It has 53 times as many residents as Alaska. Yet California, Wyoming, and Alaska all walk into the Senate chamber with exactly 2 votes.
Which leads to an absolutely staggering data point from our sources regarding modern representation.
Let's hear it.
In the 2020 Senate, there was a perfectly divided 50-50 tie between the Democratic and Republican parties. But if you add up the populations of the states they represented, those 50 Democratic senators represented 186 million Americans.
And the Republicans.
The 50 Republican senators represented 145 million Americans.
That is a 41 million person difference. One half of the chamber represents 41 million more citizens than the other half, yet they wield the exact same amount of legislative power to pass laws.
And we have to remember the ripple effect here. The Senate is the body that confirms Supreme Court justices.
Oh, right.
So this small state, counter-majoritarian bias, bleeds directly out of the legislative branch and permanently shapes the ideological makeup of the judicial branch as well.
Okay, so the Electoral College and the Senate explicitly favor geography over raw population. But what about the House of Representatives? That is literally called the People's House.
Right.
It's divided into 435 districts, specifically based on population size. That should be a perfect majoritarian reflection of the country, right?
In theory, yes. Every congressional district has roughly 760,000 people in it. The problem isn't the number of people inside the lines. The problem is who gets to draw the lines around those people.
And that brings us to the dark art of gerrymandering.
Yes, it does.
Okay, let's unpack gerrymandering, because the mechanics of how this works are brilliant and completely terrifying. Imagine you are hosting a party and ordering a pizza.
Okay, I'm with you.
The pizza is 1/3 pepperoni and 2/3 plain cheese. Now, if you hand a blindfolded person a pizza cutter and tell them to slice it normally, almost every slice will be mostly cheese, and a few slices will have the pepperoni on them. That's a fair representation of the whole pie.
Right, a random fair cut.
If you hand the pizza cutter to the pepperoni lovers, and you let them cut the pie however they want, they won't cut straight lines. They will carve incredibly weird, jagged, snake-like slices. They will carefully draw the lines to ensure that almost every single slice has 51% pepperoni on it and 49% cheese.
And the result of that math is that even though the pepperoni lovers only represent 1/3 of the total pizza, they just want control of almost every single slice.
Exactly.
That is the exact mathematical logic of gerrymandering.
State legislatures generally have the power to draw these congressional district maps every 10 years, right after the census. And the text details 2 specific surgical tactics they use to maximize their party's advantage: cracking and packing.
Let's look at how they deploy these.
Mm.
Cracking is exactly what it sounds like. Let's say you control the map, and you have a dense city in your state where 80% of the voters belong to the opposing party.
Okay.
If you draw a circle around that city, the opposition gets a guaranteed seat in Congress. You don't want that. So you crack the city. You draw district lines that slice the city into 5 different pieces like a pie, and you extend those slices way out into the rural conservative suburbs.
So you dilute their voting power.
Exactly. You spread those city voters so thinly across 5 different districts that they never reach a 50% majority in any of them. Their votes are completely drowned out.
Okay, cracking makes sense to me. But packing seems counterintuitive. Why would you want to pack all of your opponent's voters together? Doesn't that just guarantee they win a seat?
It does guarantee they win that specific seat.
Mm.
But it's a sacrifice play.
How so?
You find an area where your opponent's voters are clustered, and you draw a bizarrely shaped district. Maybe it looks like a pair of earmuffs or a squiggly snake, to capture as many of them as possible into one single district.
Ah.
They will win that packed district in a massive landslide, say 90% to 10%. But in doing so, you have effectively wasted 40% of their votes.
Because they only needed 51% to win the seat.
Precisely. By trapping all their surplus voters in one place, you've removed them from the surrounding map, allowing your party to easily win the 3 or 4 neighboring districts with comfortable 55% margins.
And the text makes a chilling point here. This isn't just guys in smoke-filled back rooms with paper maps and pencils anymore like it was in the 1800s.
Not at all.
Since the 2010 redistricting cycle, political operatives have been using incredibly detailed commercial data, voter history files, and high-speed computer algorithms to draw these maps. They run millions of simulations to find the exact map that maximizes their power.
The text calls it surgical precision. It is literally weaponized math.
And because the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that they will not intervene to strike down partisan gerrymandering, arguing it's a political issue, not a judicial one, state legislatures have only been emboldened to draw more extreme, mathematically impenetrable maps.
The result is a House of Representatives that often doesn't actually reflect the overall popular vote of the state it represents.
So if we step back and look at the whole diagnostic X-ray of the American political system we've built so far, you have elite campaign money dictating policy over the desires of average voters. You have millions of citizens in territories with no voting representation at all. You have an electoral college and a Senate that heavily artificially favor rural geography over actual population. And you have a House of Representatives legally rigged by computer-generated gerrymandering.
Which naturally forces us to ask a deeply psychological question about the system.
What's that?
If you are a citizen trapped in one of those packed districts, and you know your vote is mathematically diluted, or if you watch a policy that 70% of the country wants get killed by a wealthy lobbying group,
Yeah.
you aren't just going to sit there calmly.
No, you're going to get incredibly angry. And that systemic frustration feels like the exact fuel source for what our text identifies as the modern stress test of American politics, the era of extreme polarization and deteriorating norms.
Yes. Political scientists have observed a dramatic shift in American political culture, accelerating rapidly since the 1990s. We are currently experiencing severe, affective polarization.
Now, affective refers to emotion, right? Not just
And
ideologies.
It's the critical distinction. Ideological polarization is when we disagree on policy. I want taxes to be 30%, you want them to be 20%. We disagree, but we can negotiate.
We can meet at 25.
Exactly. Affective polarization, though, is a deep emotional hostility. It's a visceral dislike, distrust, and abhorrence of the opposing side. It's no longer you have the wrong policy. It has mutated into you are a fundamentally bad person and your political party is an existential threat trying to destroy the country.
And looking at the data in our encyclopedic source, this friction isn't just happening in a vacuum. The text maps out how the ideological composition of both parties has shifted asymmetrically to create this explosive dynamic.
Yes, the data shows that the major parties have not shifted equally. The text notes that while the Democratic Party has moved significantly to the left over the past decade, particularly on social, cultural, and religious issues, the Republican Party has shifted substantially further to the right.
So the ideological overlap that used to exist in the center has completely vanished.
It's gone.
And the history of how this combativeness became institutionalized is really revealing. The text points to a major turning point in the 1990s, with the rise of Republican strategist and later Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich.
Yes. Gingrich introduced what observers called a take no prisoners or no holds barred style of politics to Washington.
To understand the impact of that, you really have to understand the culture he was disrupting. Before the 1990s, there was a strong unwritten norm in Congress of gentility.
Right.
You would fight hard during the election campaign, but once you were in Washington, your opponents were primarily viewed as colleagues. You had to work with them, negotiate with them, and often socialize with them to pass legislation.
Gingrich explicitly sought to destroy that paradigm. He taught his party to view Democrats not as colleagues with different ideas, but as literal enemies to be defeated.
The text quotes historical descriptions showing how he instructed candidates to frame their opponents using words like traitors, liars, and cheaters.
It fundamentally shifted the incentive structure. The goal was no longer political success through compromise. The goal was total domination and humiliation of the opposition. It's what we call today owning the other side.
And the text shows how this combative strategy evolved over the decades. It mentions Karl Rove in the 2000s realizing that elections aren't won by moving to the center and trying to persuade the moderate swing voter.
No, they are won by intensely energizing your core radical base.
You turn out your true believers by making them fear the opposition. Which ultimately brings us to the Trump era, which our sources describe as replacing traditional Burkean conservatism with a highly aggressive new populism.
And the collateral damage of this shift from policy debate to existential warfare has been the rapid, terrifying deterioration of democratic norms.
Norms aren't laws, right? They're just the unwritten rules.
Exactly. Norms are the soft guardrails that keep a democracy functioning smoothly.
Mhm.
The mutual toleration of your opponents and the forbearance of power. The text highlights several of these guardrails snapping.
Give me an example.
For instance, candidates are increasingly abandoning traditional retail politicking.
Retail politicking, like kissing babies at the local diner, going to the Iowa State Fair, or holding open town halls where random citizens can stand up and ask unscripted, tough questions.
Those events force politicians to interact with people who disagree with them. But today, candidates are retreating to what the text calls safe spaces.
Oh, right.
They only do interviews on highly partisan media outlets that will praise them. They only speak at closed fundraisers or rallies filled with their own supporters. The text even notes a rising trend of candidates simply refusing to participate in public debates.
Because if you view the other side as illegitimate enemies, debating them implies they have a valid point of view. But avoiding these tough interactions creates a dangerous artificial bubble. It reinforces the idea to the base that any form of compromise is a traitorous betrayal.
But the most alarming norm deterioration highlighted in the text, the one that political scientists view as an acute crisis, is the rising trend of election denialism.
The ultimate bedrock principle of any democratic system is the peaceful transfer of power. The losing candidate has to stand up, admit they lost, and accept the results.
Without that, the system simply cannot function. But the text states that driven by baseless claims of massive, coordinated voter fraud, majorities of Republican voters and candidates no longer support this bedrock principle.
Right.
Candidates are increasingly refusing to commit to accepting election results if they lose, framing any defeat as inherently illegitimate.
And this isn't just theoretical political rhetoric. The text explicitly connects this rhetoric to physical violence, pointing directly to the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, where a mob violently attempted to stop the Constitution's certification of the election.
And the fallout from that continues. The source notes that hundreds of officials who publicly claimed the 2020 election was rigged are actively running for state offices that would put them in charge of overseeing future elections.
Which leads scholars in the text to issue a very stark warning. For the first time in American history, the structural mechanics and the behavioral norms have degraded to the point where there is a real distinct possibility that a legitimately elected president might be prevented from taking office. The system is undergoing an unprecedented stress test.
It really is.
When you lay it all out, like that institutional roadblocks, the weaponized gerrymandering, the billions of dollars in dark money, and this toxic behavioral breakdown, it is absolutely no wonder that our source text highlights a 2022 poll showing that 69% of Democrats AD, 69% of Republicans fear the nation's democracy is in danger of collapse.
We're looking at a diagnostic chart of a patient in critical condition.
Does the text offer any medicine? What are the systemic solutions?
It does explore several proposed reforms aimed at modernizing this antiquated system. Most scholars and advocates focus their attention on the two most powerful counter-majoritarian institutions we discussed: the Supreme Court and Congress.
Let's start with the Supreme Court. Right now, justices are appointed for life, which means every time a justice dies or retires, it triggers an apocalyptic, high-stakes political war in the Senate. Because both parties know that single seat might dictate constitutional law for the next 40 years. It's incredibly chaotic.
To lower that temperature, the primary proposed reform is to implement term limits for Supreme Court justices, or even subject them to public elections.
Wait, electing federal Supreme Court justices? That sounds like a radical departure from the founders' design.
It sounds radical at the federal level, but the text points out a fascinating precedent. 33 states already use some form of election for their state Supreme Courts. It is a proven functioning model at the local level.
Oh, I had no idea.
But if elections are too extreme, constitutional scholars propose one-time staggered term limits, usually suggesting 8 to 10 years.
How would that fix the chaos?
It would regularize the appointments. Every president would know exactly how many appointments they get per term. It would end the morbid death watch of aging justices, lower the apocalyptic stakes of confirmation battles, and theoretically ensure the court is slightly more responsive to the current era of the country.
Rather than enforcing the political alignment of 2 decades prior.
Exactly.
Okay, that tackles the judicial branch. What about the legislative branch? We have politicians who have been sitting in the House or Senate for 30, 40, sometimes even 50 years. They are entirely insulated from the consequences of their votes.
The major proposed reform here is congressional term limits. And the history of this movement is fascinating because we actually got incredibly close to implementing it.
We did.
In the early 1990s, there's a massive grassroots movement across the country demanding term limits for federal lawmakers.
And the states actually acted on it, right?
They did. 23 state governments successfully passed laws capping the number of terms their specific U.S. representatives and senators could serve. It was a central promise of Newt Gingrich's famous contract with America to pass a federal constitutional amendment enforcing it nationwide.
So what happened? If 23 states passed it, why don't we have term limits today?
Because the system protected itself. In 1995, the Supreme Court struck down all 23 of those state laws in a landmark case called U.S. Term Limits, Inc. v. Thornton.
Really?
The court ruled 5-4 that states do not have the constitutional authority to impose stricter qualifications for federal office than those already explicitly listed in the U.S. Constitution, which are only age, citizenship, and residency.
And let me guess, the constitutional amendment proposed in Congress failed.
It failed to get the required two-thirds supermajority. Unsurprisingly, it is very difficult to convince a room full of career politicians to voluntarily vote themselves out of a job.
But the text notes that the movement isn't dead. In fact, it's shifting its strategy.
Yes. Since Congress won't pass it, advocacy groups are utilizing a rarely discussed mechanism in the Constitution, an Article V convention.
An Article V convention.
They're currently pushing for 34 states to officially call for a constitutional convention, which would allow the states to bypass Congress entirely and draft a term limits amendment directly.
Bypassing the federal government to fix the federal government. That is the ultimate test of the federalist system we started this conversation with.
Exactly. The nesting dolls fighting back.
We have covered an absolute mountain of material today. Let's pull all of these threads together.
It has been an incredible journey through the mechanics of power.
We started by completely shattering the illusion of a centralized government, realizing the sheer chaotic scale of the 89,500 local governments operating under the radar. We walked through the brutal mathematical inevitability of Duverger's law, showing how the first-past-the-post system locks us into a two-party duopoly.
And we peered into the shadows of the influence market, looking at the Gielens and Page study to understand how billions of dollars shape policy while the average voter's preference registers as statistically near zero.
We examined the severe representation gaps, focusing on the literal disenfranchisement of millions of U.S. citizens living in territories under the century-old insular cases. And we unpacked the structural quirks, the Electoral College, the Senate's massive small state bias, and the weaponization of gerrymandering that make the U.S. such a uniquely counter-majoritarian system.
And finally, we saw how all of the structural frustrations have boiled over, moving from polite ideological debates to an era of effective polarization, eroding the fundamental guardrails of democracy, and sparking desperate calls for sweeping reforms like term limits.
If there's one overarching takeaway for you listening to this deep dive, it is this. Understanding the hidden machinery of this system is the only possible way to effectively navigate it or to demand meaningful changes to it.
That's right. Whether you are voting in a nonpartisan election for your local school board or you are analyzing the rollout of a massive federal policy, seeing the matrix changes everything.
It really does.
Once you understand how the math of single-member districts works or how the rules of inherent state powers operate, you stop just being angry at the politicians playing the game. You start critically examining the rules of the game board itself.
I think that is incredibly empowering. You know, at the top of the show, we talked about looking at the blueprints of the American political system. We talked about how, unlike a clean engine, the American blueprint looks murky and chaotic. But I want to leave you with a final idea to chew on, something that builds on all the math and history we unpacked today.
Let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time today talking about gridlock. We talked about a system that ignores the majority, a system that favors wealthy elites, and a system where the pace of change is agonizingly, painfully slow. But remember the history. The Founding Fathers, those men who debated in the sweltering heat of Philadelphia in 1787, explicitly designed the American government with a sprawling, complex web of checks and balances.
They did.
Their greatest fear wasn't inefficiency. Their greatest fear was the tyranny of the majority. They wanted a system that slowed down the passions of the public. They designed a machine that forced arduous compromise, making it incredibly difficult for any one faction to seize total control and radically change the country overnight.
That was the whole point.
So as you look at the gridlock, the counter-majoritarian quirks of the Senate, and the massive systemic roadblocks we explored today, ask yourself a difficult question. Is the American political system actually broken? Or is it working exactly the way it was originally designed to?
It's a tough question.
And if it is working exactly as designed, is an 18th century blueprint built for a slow-moving agrarian society fundamentally incompatible with a fast-paced, highly polarized 21st century world?
Something to really think about.
Something to think about the next time you look at a ballot. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.